Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, everyone. I'm Meg Bouvier. Welcome to Ask the Grant Writing Expert. I am a neuroscientist turned NIH staff writer turned full-time NIH grant writer. And I'm here to answer your questions about your application. So you all know me as the creator of the library of courses that you have access to. And my goal with this forum is to be able to answer questions for people who typically view courses so that there's some sort of one-on-one mechanism for you. So grab yourself a coffee and let's get started. So just to remind you, you are in listen-only mode. There is a Q&A box. You'll see that in the toolbar on the Zoom panel. So you can ask your questions by typing them into the Q&A box. And I would imagine I have a list of questions here that people have emailed me just over the last couple of days. So I would imagine that as we approach the October deadlines, that people have a huge number of questions. So, and I see that people are still joining us. So for those who are just joining, you're in listen-only mode, but feel free to type any questions at all about anything having to do with NIH grant writing or grantsmanship into the Q&A box. So while I wait for people to type their questions, I am going to cover some questions that I got by email during the week. So one I got about an hour ago was, since I'm writing an R01 application, is it necessary to include paragraphs for rigors of prior research and scientific rigor in the research strategy section? I read a few examples from my colleagues and did not see the rigor paragraphs in their R21 applications. So one might make the argument that you don't need rigor of prior research for certain types of applications, like, something like the R21 or like a Katz R01, where there is a lower expectation of preliminary data, or, as in the case of the Katz, you can't have preliminary data. So you might not have a rigor of prior research section, but I might argue that in terms of a scientific rigor section in your research strategy, one ought to have that on every single solitary mechanism at NIH. It shows up in the instructions for K awards, for every R level mechanism, for center grant applications, those are the P mechanisms, for cooperative agreements, those are the U mechanisms, for the T training grants, like a T32. There is language in the instructions and scoring criteria having to do with scientific rigor on every single one of those. And my response to this grantee was, I probably read over 50 summary statements a year. If I had $1 for every time I have seen a summary statement that complained that the grantee did not adequately cover the scientific rigor scoring criteria, that would be lovely. So I would argue that you've got to have that in every single mechanism. So don't neglect to, and you may think to yourself, but it's all over the experimental design section. It's all over my data analyses. I would still pull out a subheader that says scientific rigor and actually reference those parts of your study design, even if you just reference back to an outline number and say we have blinded investigators, we're running the appropriate controls, we're running a sham version of this, we're, whatever it is that includes scientific rigor. It could also include reproducibility and transparency and things like that. So please always include scientific rigor in every single grant application you write. Okay, so I'm going to pause because I have a couple of things that were typed in by attendees, and those questions always take precedence. So the first one is, how do you approach the preliminary data section? Is it like a mini study of your larger study that is just underpowered? Or is it a set of studies that show you can do the methods you propose, or a combination? So it's a really good question, and it actually could be any of those things. I've even seen people use other people's studies as preliminary data, not exclusively, of course. You have to have some of your own as well. But basically, it's anything that will convince the reviewers of the feasibility and rationale for the study. So that could be, as you said, like a mini study that's underpowered. So it's just smaller sample sizes of what you propose to do. Or it could be a separate set of studies by you or others that show that the methods or combinations of methods that you're proposing would be feasible in this or a similar cohort. So any of those are fair game. NIH has a very broad definition of what they consider preliminary data, and it truly is anything that speaks to the feasibility and the rationale of the study design. So read it as if you were a reviewer, or better yet, send it to a colleague who could look at it as if they were a reviewer and ask them, do these preliminary data speak to the feasibility and the rationale behind my proposed project? If the answer is yes, then it's fair game for preliminary data. Okay, so the other question, for an R66 without an R33-34 component and having a higher funding amount per year, is it safe to assume that this mechanism would be more advanced and thus the proposed project too, i.e. between an R21 and an R01? That's a great question. I haven't done an R56 in a long time, and I'm actually going to pull it up really quickly. I'm sorry, an R61. I'm thinking of R56 because that's one of the ones that I want to discuss. So, so an R61 is a phase one. So just so that people understand what these phased mechanisms are. So the person here refers to the R33-34, which is another phased or gated mechanism where it's biphasic. You may also know, like the K99 R00 is another one. These are mechanisms where you have to achieve a set of milestones in order to get the second part of the funding. So NIH has a whole host of these phased mechanisms. So the R61 it's part of a biphasic approach to funding exploratory and/or developmental research. The R61 provides support for the first phase of the award. This activity code is used in lieu of the R21 activity code when larger budgets and/or project periods are required to establish feasibility for the project. So, so again, the question here was for an R61 without the 33-34 component and having a higher funding amount per year, is it safe to assume that this mechanism would be more advanced and thus the proposed project too between an R21 and R01? And I would say no. I would say that the R61 is very similar to an R21, except that you have some justification for needing a larger budget. That would be my take on it. With all of these answers, I always suggest talk to your program officer, because these answers can vary by institute. So always have a conversation with your program officer about these things. But my sense is that it would be very similar to an R21 in that it's something where you have limited preliminary data and you're trying to lay down enough data to convince reviewers of the feasibility to move on to the second part, to the phase 2 part of it. So I don't think it would be more advanced than an R21. I think it simply requires a larger budget for some reason. So, but again, ask your program officer about that. So hopefully that answers your question. Keep the questions coming in the Q&A box for people who are just logging on. I have a bunch more that were emailed to me, again, just in the last couple of days. One of them actually was not emailed to me, but I've seen a curious uptick in traffic to a blog post I wrote about 8 years ago on what is an R56 mechanism. So this is a question that I very rarely get, and we very rarely have traffic on that blog post, but there is a big upsurge in an R56 mechanism. So has anyone ever heard of this R56 mechanism? So if so, either raise your hand or say it in the chat box. We've got somebody who has actually heard of it. So I'm actually shocked that this person has heard of it. I very infrequently hear of people getting an R56 mechanism, and I think there's been an uptick in traffic to that blog post because we're at the end of the fiscal year. So as most of you know, October 1 in theory is supposed to be the start of the government fiscal year, and NIH's fiscal year is supposed to begin on October 1. In reality, the year never begins on October 1 unless it's a presidential election year, in which case Congress is trying to play nicely and show that they can play nicely in order to get people to vote for their candidates in November. The other 3 years that are off cycle of the presidential election years, the budgets might not be approved until like January, February, or even later. In which case NIH operates at 80% of the previous year's budget, and the funding lines temporarily drop for any awards that may be coming up for their notice of award at the tail end of the year or the very beginning of the calendar year. So September is the last month of the fiscal year for NIH. And so some program officers find that they have use it or lose it money left over. So often what will happen is that grantees who were in the gray zone of funding may get, maybe from 6 or 9 months ago, may get picked up for funding in September or late August if the Institute is becoming aware that they have underspent during the course of the year and they have some discretionary money. The other thing that you may see is program officers exercising their right to distribute R56 funds. So there are very, very few mechanisms at NIH that are at the discretion of the program officer. Another one might be like the NCI R37, the Merit Award, which is completely at the discretion of program officers to convert really accomplished grantees with a good score on an R01 to longer periods of funding. So the R56 is like that. It's a discretionary award. It's usually 1 year. Sometimes it's 2. But basically it can be either grantees who were right at the cutoff of funding for an R01 mechanism. But I've seen them. I had a grantee years and years ago whose R01 scored at 30%. So like not even close to the funding line. And he was picked up for R56 funding because he had a really strong relationship with his program officer. The person really believed in him and his project, and they wanted to award him 1 to 2 years of funding under this discretionary R56 mechanism so that he could beef up the preliminary data and come in with a stronger R01 application, which is exactly what he did and was funded subsequently. So the take-home message here is build a relationship with your program officer. This is yet another way that the program officer can be a really strong advocate for you. So, and I'm seeing that one person here is saying that 2 of their colleagues got R56 funding a couple of years ago at their institute. And judging by, I think we had 14 hits on that blog post yesterday alone. Like this is an 8-year-old blog post that never gets traffic. So I'm guessing that some people are getting picked up for R56 funding. So again, can't apply for it, but you may get picked up by a program officer who really believes in your work. Okay, another question that just came in, relevant to the question on preliminary data, how much changes we can make to our pilot preliminary data to make the reviewers believe that our proposed project will work and be feasible? So is the question, I'm not quite sure what you're asking. What kind of changes do you have to make to pilot preliminary data to make the reviewers believe that our proposed project will work and be feasible? So I'm not sure what you mean by changes. Are you talking about on a resubmission, or I'm a little confused about the word changes in there. So, I mean, I get a lot of questions about preliminary data in general. So the more typical way of asking that is how much preliminary data is enough? And that's the $1 million question. So and you might ask your program officer and your mentors and your colleagues, and they may all think that you have enough preliminary, okay, this is, they may feel you have enough preliminary data to convince them of the feasibility of the project, and then you send it in, you submit it, and reviewers say, oh, not enough preliminary data. So, the saying is that reviewers have an almost insatiable appetite for preliminary data. It can be very challenging. So this person is clarifying modifications to existing methods. So I'm still not exactly sure what you're saying. Do you need to modify your existing methods on the application in the proposed project? I'm not really sure what the question is. So you're putting in an application and you have preliminary data. What about the methodology on the preliminary data are you asking? Or are you proposing that you need to make changes on the proposed project? Or obviously, if you are proposing substantial changes to the methodology as compared to the pilot data, then you may be looking at a methods grant if that's what you're asking. I'm not exactly sure what it is you're asking about these changes to existing methodology. If you're proposing extensive changes to existing methodology, then it may be a methods grant. And then that becomes the focus rather than actually gathering data using that methodology. It may be demonstrating the feasibility of the methodology. And where that line is to convince reviewers is anybody's guess. The best you can do is ask program officers and mentors and colleagues and hope that there's consensus among them. And even then, you may not have consensus among the reviewers. Part of it is just getting a feel for a given study section, which is why it often takes multiple submissions, because even if you pick the optimal study section, it may take you a few submissions to get a feel for how that study section feels about the feasibility of what you're proposing, or how much preliminary data you have, or the qualifications of the team, or whatever it might be. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not entirely sure that I did answer it, but I think I may have touched on the key points. So feel free to continue to put your questions in the Q&A box. It looks like I have answered the ones that are in there, so we can clear them out. So I will continue to review the questions that I got during the week with the remaining time. So I'm working on a lot of Katz R01s, and I'm actually working on one today. But from another applicant, I got a question. I'm trying to submit to the Katz. There's specific guidance that says applications submitted to this FOA must not include preliminary data. Applications must include a separate attachment describing the change in research direction. Here we are having confusion on what constitutes preliminary data when it comes to the Katz. Does simulative analysis showing confidence in the approach constitute preliminary data? Once again, this is the million-dollar question. Easily the biggest question I get on the Katz, and the problem I see most on the summary statements from Katz ESI R01 applications is what constitutes preliminary data. Obviously you're not going to, so the Katz is meant for early stage investigators. It's an R01 level application. It's meant for people moving in a new direction. So it's kind of like an R21, but with a bigger budget, and meant for ESIs. But what do they mean by new direction? Like what do they mean by preliminary data? Like, we've somehow got to establish the feasibility of what we're proposing, but we can't call that preliminary data. So where's the line? And I think there's an enormous amount of confusion about this. I have had grantees talk this over at length with a program officer, and the program officer gives their blessing to the application and what they're considering a new direction and no preliminary data. And then the reviewers say, no, this is not a new direction. What you're presenting support the feasibility of the project actually constitutes preliminary data. So it's a little crazy making, and I got to tell you, after reading several dozen applications and summary statements since the Katz has appeared on the horizon almost 2 years ago now, I don't have a firm sense of what it is. I can tell you that by and large, it seems that if you have used some sort of methodology or a version of your methodology in a different system, a different disease area than the one that you're proposing, that sometimes seems to fly with the reviewers, but not always. So in this instance, when this person is saying, does simulative analysis showing confidence in the approach constitute preliminary data? My guess is no, but occasionally that will set reviewers off, and they will say that it does constitute preliminary data. So this is another thing where you're going to have to, put it in and hope for the best and just try to get a feel for how the study section is viewing your application. Okay, so next question that I got, and for those who are just joining us, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. This was a great one. I'm now a PI on an R01 that was transferred to me due to the original PI leaving the institution. Have I lost my ESI status? So the quick answer is, I'm not sure, and you should ask the R01, the program officer for that particular R01, but my guess is yes, you will lose your ESI status. But maybe the better question is, does it matter? And so what I emailed this grantee back was, if the project is really early, let's say it's a 5-year R01, and it's in the first year and it's being transferred to you as the PI within the first year, maybe it doesn't matter, because you're going to have almost the full funding period to put your stamp on this project and to be senior author on the publications and to demonstrate on a competing renewal to reviewers that you have the chops to successfully run an R01, which essentially means to hit your milestones, stay within budget, and publish. So that's the goal, right? I mean, you want to, on your first R01, your goal is to be able to demonstrate success by staying within the timeline and the budget and publishing and accomplishing your aims to demonstrate that success on a competing renewal. So if you feel that there's enough time left on this project for you to have a shot at doing that, then it may not matter. If you don't, if it's a 5-year R01 and let's say it's year 4, oh my God, I would do everything you can to argue with your university or medical center to try to have somebody else put in as a PI on this R01 so you don't lose your ESI status, because this could really sabotage your attempts to establish an R01 funded independent research lab. Because you're not going to have time, if you only have a year or 2 left on the project, to demonstrate success on a competing renewal, because you will not have been at the helm of the ship long enough to do it. So that was my answer to that person. And I don't know if anybody else has experience with that happening, but that was my take on that. Okay, let's see what other questions I had come in. I'm still getting a lot of questions on the Biosketch. So among them, how to write a junior faculty Biosketch personal statement versus the mid-career or senior one. I think I actually covered this in a tutorial, but I'm going to cover it in brief because I'm getting so many questions on Biosketches again. So if it's like, say, your first R01, the personal statement of your Biosketch should probably be close to a page. And the reality is you're not going to have a really long list of grant application, grant support, or really long contribution to science section with 5 contributions and 4 publications for representative publications for each one. You're just not going to have that. So what to do to convince reviewers that the project's in the right hands and you have the chops to lead this. You want to write a nice long personal statement in the Biosketch. So I would devote like a full page to that. And focus on your training and your subject matter expertise and any first author and last author publications and awards you've won and highlighting things like that. If you're more senior, it can be like a paragraph. And in the last few minutes, I want to pause and answer another question. Just a quick R01 Katz question. If one submits to an R01 Katz, are they still permitted eligible to submit a regular R01 in line with their current expertise? I've always been curious if the R01 Katz is intended to be a permanent pivot. No, it's definitely not expected to be a permanent pivot. And in fact, you know, like I mean, I think what you're asking is it okay if the Katz, if I have a line of research and I put a Katz in and it starts a second line of research, do I have to pick between them? I think that's what you're asking me. And the question, the answer is absolutely do not have to pick between them. I have many mid-career and senior clients who have many lines of research in their lab and consistently put in competing renewals on R01s, even to different institutes in different areas that are obviously somewhat related. But no, just because you're putting in a Katz to start a second line of research in your lab, I think the norm is that that is not in lieu of the original line of research. It's a second line of research. So it's fine to keep both of them. Okay, so I've seen some COI biosketches with my bibliography link, some without any link and some with just a search link in PubMed. Is there any fixed guidance on this? Do a my bibliography. They use that on the sample, the NIH sample application. It can be Cyan, it can be any of those types of hyperlinks that will send them to the full list of publications, but definitely do that. I think it's best practice. I don't think there's actual rules about it, but I think it's the vast majority of biosketches I see on successful applications do that. What exactly is the Katz on an R02? I have never heard of that before. I missed the first. Oh, this is actually an R01, and it's Katz with a K. So K-A-T-Z. So it's a person, the Stephen Katz R01 application. And I think there are 3 types of them. They're all for ESIs. One allows a clinical trial, one does not, and one is for basic experimental studies with humans, subjects. So it's basically it's an R01 mechanism specifically for ESI. So it's one of the many ESI specific, like the DP2, for example. It's an R01 specific to ESIs, and it's meant for a new direction in your lab. So you are not allowed to have preliminary data. Now, having said that, I certainly have grantees who have preliminary data and withhold it, and they put in a Katz, and in the 9 months that they're awaiting a funding decision on the Katz, they generate more preliminary data so that they can be competitive going in as a regular parent R01 at the end of that if they don't get the Katz. But it's really meant to be for people who are starting ESIs who are looking for R01 funding in a direction that's new for their lab. And the question earlier had to do with what constitutes no data, because somehow you have to demonstrate the feasibility of what you're proposing. So the concept of having no data is a little sketchy and a little hard to nail down. And just so that people know, I know we're out of time, but if anybody ever misses some or all of these sessions, I have a YouTube channel where these recordings are being posted. I believe we're going to be releasing the link to that in an upcoming highlights email, which you are all subscribed to. So you can look for that link there, and tell your colleagues, everybody at your organization is is eligible to attend these sessions and to watch the recordings. So, and you can always email me questions as well, and I'll email you a response and cover it here. But then at least you get, if you can't attend the session, you get a response to your question. So thank you everybody for attending. I know that we're fast on the heels of the October deadlines. So I know many of you are in the trenches writing, as I am. So I wish you all the very best of luck, and have a wonderful day, and good luck with your writing. Take care. Bye-bye.